Welcome to the very first Ohio Genealogical Society live webinar titled An Unlikely Source by Noel Poirier. OGS is committed to providing the genealogical community with the very best education and research opportunities for the state of Ohio. And to that end, we're proud to begin offering our services both at our beautiful library in Belleville, Ohio, and online. Our growth depends on your participation and your generosity, and I hope today's webinar demonstrates the value of our membership. Few housekeeping notes for today. We're scheduled for about an hour. It may run over a few minutes, but we understand if you need to leave. Noel will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and we will have a Q&A at the end for about 15 minutes. We ask that you mute yourself and turn off the video during the lecture. That would be helpful. And please feel free to use the chat to post any questions along the way, and we'll take them at the end. Again, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded for future use. With that, I'd like to introduce Noel Poirier, our Executive Director of OGS. He comes to us with 30 years in the museum, history, and nonprofit sectors. He's worked for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, 2 historical farms in Pennsylvania, the historic Bethlehem Partnership, the National Watch and Clock Museum, and the Age of Steam Roundhouse Museum. I've had the pleasure of working with Noel and our Board of Trustees over the last 2 years and seen their commitment to making genealogical research accessible for all. I hope you enjoy our webinar. With that, I'm handing it over to you.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everybody here today. I appreciate you joining us for this webinar. Since this was the first webinar that we're kind of tackling, I wanted to do something that I thought would be more fun than necessarily technical. And so this is a talk that I give to chapters and to and historical societies on a pretty regular basis about what started my kind of search for my own family history. I think all of us who do family history and genealogy have an individual or a family or something that got us really interested in pursuing it. And this story is the story that did it for me. I'm going to start sharing my screen real quick. That way you don't have to look at me anymore. Okay. So my family kind of history journey started when I received an old worn ledger book from my mother, along with a photograph. That's what you're seeing on the screen. My mother received it from her grandmother. And the only thing my mother knew about this individual was his he went by the name Grandpa Murphy, and that was it. That's all we knew. And the ledger book was filled with poetry that he had written over a certain period of time. And little slips of paper like the one you see here with names on them and things like that. And so this is kind of what got me started. And the reason I got this book is that I have a bachelor's degree in American history and a master's degree in American history. And I'm as kind of the default family historian as a result. And so anything that is family related gets shipped to me to kind of sort out. And some of it's really interesting and useful, and some of it is exactly what you can imagine it is. And so that's how I started ending up kind of getting these things. I wasn't really interested in my family history when these things started coming to me. It was just, that was the nature of my existence, I guess, was that they were going to come to me. But as I pursued this, once I got this ledger and this photograph, I wanted to learn more about what this was about, particularly this individual. And so as a historian, I looked at the ledger book and the photograph as source material for me to figure out who this person was and what his life was like. And what I discovered is that, as you know, and as a historian, we're used to looking at a lot of different sources, mainly because we're telling stories. So we're not necessarily simply interested in who his parents were or who his children were, as we are interested in fleshing out his life, the life of his community, the life of his neighbors. And that's kind of what directed me in this. And from that, I created my huge family tree that I have worked on now for years. But he was really the catalyst for me to get me started. And so since he was that, I tend to like to talk about him and go through it. Now, I should clarify, I didn't know anything about him when I started researching him. All I knew was he was Grandpa Murphy, and what was written in this ledger book. And I figured out in the ledger book, I saw things where it said J.G. Murphy, John G. Murphy. So my guess was his name was Jonathan Murphy. But I didn't know any of that at the time. I just knew his name was Grandpa Murphy, J.G. Murphy, and he had this ledger book. Now, the ledger book, the poetry that's in the ledger book, which is nice, was what really kind of helped me move into his life and into the life of his community, and figure out more and more about him. What was interesting to me was, as I went through the ledger book and I looked at the poems, again, and trying to track down who this man was, there were certain poems that had place names in them, right? So that was helpful. There's Ode to Delaware, White Marsh, Wacomico Chapel, Hard Bargain Hill, beneath White Marsh's stately oaks, Ancient Old Northumberland, Rosebuds of White Marsh. So I had these place names that he had written poems about, these places. And for me, at the time, I was living in Williamsburg, Virginia, where I was working with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation at the time. And so we had a wonderful library there called the John D. Rockefeller Library. It's an amazing library. So I went there, and I went to the College of William and Mary's library at SWEM, and I pulled out every atlas I could find for essentially the East Coast Mid-Atlantic states, because I knew that that was roughly where my family was from. And so I went to these atlases looking for states or looking for communities where I could find these place names within a reasonable proximity to one another, hoping that maybe I would be able to nail down where this was taking place. And so what was interesting for me at the time, it was kind of fun, was it turned out that where I needed to look was just up the road from me in Virginia. And that was pretty amazing. What I discovered was the area where you see White Marsh, Wacomico Church, Rehoboth Church, Hard Bargain, they were all within about a 2-mile distance of one another in a little part of Virginia called Northumberland County. And so as a result, I was able to kind of figure out that, okay, I've got Grandpa Murphy living in this little area of Northumberland County, based on his poems. If you're going to don't mind and you'll indulge me, I'm going to read some of the poems as we go along through the talk. This is a poem entitled "Attention Old Northumberland." It is a poem that he obviously wrote right around the time of an election in Northumberland County, because that's the gist of the poem. And some of the words I will not say because I couldn't make them out in reading it and transcribing the poetry. So I'll go ahead and read this poem. Attention, Old Northumberland. Attention, Old Northumberland, we have a word to say. There are to gallant armies in battles fierce away. One is old democracy, long pledged to Bourbon rule, who makes the laborers his dupe and takes him out of his school. In spring, they will be advancing, their banners in full view. They will call for votes in thunderous tones, but the choice is with you. The second is Republicans, the tillers of the soil, who represent the interest of the sons of honest toil. Then all you gallant yeomen, come join our ranks today and bring your neighbors with you to help us win the day. Then we will teach those Bourbons we are not their dupes at all, but the sons of honest yeomen come to their country's call. And when the battle is over and victory with us lies, we will holler hallow till it reaches the sky. So he's writing about an upcoming election. And what I learned from that is he's in Northumberland. He's a Republican. And so I was able to figure out, where his politics lay from that. And he was obviously, if anybody's ever been to this part of Northumberland County, Virginia, it is still an incredibly rural agricultural community. I've walked these roads and I've been in the graveyards. I've been to all these places that we're going to show you. And it is an incredibly rural place made up of people who essentially work the soil. So who was Jonathan Murphy? This is information I know now. I did not know at the time. He was born in Delaware originally. During the Civil War, he served in the 4th Delaware Infantry Regiment. And what was interesting about that, and I think what explains how he ended up where he did in Virginia, was the 4th Delaware Infantry Regiment during the course of the Civil War was stationed principally at Gloucester Point, Virginia, which is right on the York River across from the town of Yorktown, Virginia, if you're familiar with the area. And therefore, just a peninsula essentially away from where he eventually settled in Northumberland County, Virginia. He was married in 1862 in Delaware. He had 9 children. The births of those children helped me figure out when he was in Northumberland County based on when they talked about where they were born. He was a farmer his whole life until his older age, when he moved to Trenton, New Jersey, to be with his daughters and brother. The picture you see on the left here is a picture of him. That is my great grandmother on the porch. Her name is Ellen. And then the young little person there, the hair, is my great grandmother, Caroline. And this is in front of my great great grandmother's house in Fieldsboro, New Jersey, just outside of Trenton. What I discovered was he moved to Northumberland County, Virginia, around sometime before December 1876. That's when one of his daughters is listed as being born there in the Wacomico Magisterial District of Northumberland County. So we know that he's there at least by then. And then we know that he leaves Northumberland County by 1886, and then he's up in Trenton, New Jersey. What I started to do, once I knew where he was, once I had figured out where he was, the next thing for me to do was to go in, and I traveled to the Northumberland County Historical Society, which is in Heathsville, Virginia. It's a beautiful little kind of crossroads. If any of you have ever been to Tidewater, Virginia, there are no real towns in Tidewater, Virginia. There are courthouses and squares and buildings around that. It takes a long time for Tidewater, Virginia, to develop what we consider as a town today because it was so agricultural. And Heathsville was where was the crossroads nearest to where Jonathan G. Murphy lived. And so what I started to do was I figured out, okay, I'm going to look in the census records for a J.G. Murphy or a Jonathan G. Murphy or just a Murphy in Wacomico District or in Northumberland County. And although Murphy is a very common name, there weren't a lot of them in Northumberland County at the time. And so what I ended up actually finding a listing for him in the 1880 census for his whole family living in the Wacomico District of Northumberland County. And then what I started to do is I looked at the poetry, was expand my reach around those census records and county records. And then I took a trip. This is a place called Hard Bargain Farm. This is a picture from the Library of Congress as part of its National Register. It is a 18th century farmhouse built on a hill just outside of Rehoboth Church in Northumberland County. My grandfather wrote about this house frequently, and so it was one of my things, icons that I managed to find. It still exists. It's still standing today, or at least it was 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And if my advice to you is when you drive into rural Virginia and you see an old house back off the road with a long driveway on it, I don't encourage you to drive down that driveway unless you know what you're doing and they know you're coming. It's a very rural community, a very private community. And you want to make sure you make your presence known before you start traipsing around people's property out there. But the house still survives. And I'll read you a poem, if you don't mind, from his book of poetry about Hard Bargain Hill. And so this one is titled Hard Bargain Hill. I wandered out one evening when all was calm and still to take a lonely ramble to old Hard Bargain Hill. The sun was near his setting when, bending with a will, I saw a young man walking down old Hard Bargain Hill. I gently stepped up to him and asked if he was ill, but he only kept on walking down old Hard Bargain Hill. I thought he might be crazy and went against my will to follow that young stranger down old Hard Bargain Hill. But soon I found was dodging me with skill, for I could see his shadow down old Hard Bargain Hill. I then retraced my footsteps, came up the hill again, and there was a lovely woman standing in the lane. I politely did salute her, not meaning any harm, when she smilingly did ask me, "Is that Hard Bargain Farm?" And so this farmhouse and this property was built by the Ball family. If you're familiar with the Ball family, Washington's in-laws are Balls, or his mother. I apologize. Washington's mother's family were Balls. So you have a lot of kind of traditional Virginia names on the northern neck of Virginia. And so it was nice because I read the poem of that my great grandfather wrote 120 years ago at the time. And I was able to go visit the house and the property. And it was very telling for me to be able to do all of that. And that's what makes it kind of interesting. One of the other things that's right up the road from Hard Bargain Hill is Rehoboth Church. This is Rehoboth Methodist Church. All the churches, my grandfather attended Rehoboth, Wacomico, and White Marsh, which was the main church for the Methodists in Northumberland County. We're all Methodist churches. One of the slips of paper that's inside of the ledger book is actually lists the names of various parishioners at Rehoboth Church, and then their tithes. So you have this wonderful, really nice list. And what was nice about that list is, as I went through that list for Rehoboth Church, and then I looked at and I cross-referenced it with the 1880 census records for that area, and then also the 1870 as well. I was able to see those same names. So I knew not only that I had the right community, but then I also had the right location, but I also could start to see the community being fleshed out and coming out of the census records as a result of this one kind of slip of paper, and being able to learn a lot more about the community and how it was structured from there, which was very nice. This is Wacomico Church. It's called Wacomico Church. This is actually in Heathsville, which is just up the road. Again, just up the road from where Hard Bargain Farm is and where my grandfather lived. Another Methodist church in that area, and another subject, of poems. It seems like my grandfather, my great grandfather, would write poems about Wacomico Chapel. He'd write poems about White Marsh Church. He never wrote poems about the church he went to all the time. He never wrote a poem about Rehoboth Church, but he wrote them about these churches. And I think you can kind of get an impression as to maybe why that is. These were kind of more fancier churches than what he had usually attended. So I'm going to go ahead and read you kind of very quickly. This is a poem that he wrote called Wacomico Chapel. There is a little chapel not very far from here where people meet to worship the God they love and fear. There all can meet together upon a common plane and show kindness to each other through the love they did obtain. The sick and poor together can come before that shrine that makes every a brother with the light of love divine. Oh, none shake off the shackles that bind you to this world. Enlist beneath the banner that Jesus has unfurled. Oh, now, poor thirsty mortal, this counsel they will give. Just step within the chapel and drink of this cup and live. If you delay much longer, the danger with you lies, and the temper will be stronger to keep you from the skies. Then ask at once for pardon while the Savior wants to save, for there is neither sin nor sorrow in the home beyond the grave. So again, he what I love about his poetry is it's not Shakespeare, but you're talking about a man who was essentially a farmer, and found beauty in the things that were around him in his immediate vicinity, and was willing to kind of put pencil to paper to write these poems. And another church that he wrote about quite a bit is White Marsh Church, and this was the kind of the master church. This is just outside Kilmarnock, Virginia. This was the main church for Methodism in Northumberland County, Virginia, and actually in this part of the northern neck of Virginia. And he wrote, like I said, several poems about White Marsh Church, which were kind of interesting. I'll just read you one of those. Beneath White Marsh's stately oaks, gray heads have knelt in prayer and found a balm for all their grief by humbly kneeling there. But those old heads have passed and gone. They are not there today, but still gray heads are kneeling in old White Marsh to pray. Them noble forms are bending, their hair floats in the breeze, while gentle voices sounding among White Marsh's trees. O Jesus, have in keeping the heads that bow today, as friends around them weeping when called to pass away. There is a goodly number who yet have never prayed, although they sit and listen in old White Marsh's shade. The people join together in one long fervent prayer that one more extra effort may find them kneeling there. So he wrote a lot about his physical surroundings, both the churches, the house, the farms that surrounded him when he was living in Northumberland County. But he also wrote about people, and this is where it really gets kind of fun, is he didn't just write about, he wrote about his friends, his neighbors, and some of those poems are fun, and some of those poems are sad, because he's writing about what's happening around him. And what was nice about these folks, and as we go through each of these particular stories, I'll hopefully be able to show you each of those folks. Again, going through those 1880 and 1870 census records, these people had real lives. These people were real people he was writing about. You could find them. You could find their name or their family's name in the records. He often wrote about children passing. And in some cases, because these children are passing between census records, and if you've done genealogy research in Virginia, particularly Tidewater, Virginia, you know how difficult that can be given what happened to many of the county records during the Civil War. In some cases, one of these poems is the only thing that might explain that somebody even existed, because those other records may have been destroyed. So it's an important kind of document towards talking about some of these young people, particularly these children. Some of these poems you'll see on the death of Boswell, Bill Simmons on a Lark, on the death of Bessie Pinkard, Luther, Lines to Laura Clayton, Bill Simmons' courtship. These are neighbors of his. My favorite are the Bill Simmons poems. I'm just going to read you one of them. Now, Bill Simmons was a wheelwright in Northumberland County. That was his trade. You see him mentioned here as a mechanic. In a community of farmers, anybody who works with their hands is going to be considered a mechanic. And Bill Simmons, as you can see, this is 1880 census. He was a 60-year-old widower, having 3 kids at home. But he apparently was a pretty good character, because my great-grandfather made a point of writing about him a couple of times. And I'll just read you one of them. It's called Bill Simmons on a Lark. "'Twas evening on Wacomico Road. Bill Simmons came with glee. His eye was bright, his heart was light, his step was bold and free. He skipped to music's measure, like a small boat out of way. Oh, Bill Simmons' life is pleasure, for he works not night or day. First he smiled, and then he laughed, and many a tale he told, and swore he'd never before knew Simmons. I swore I never knew before that Simmons was so bold. But Simmons had been out to take a lonely ramble, and somewhere on the route had met Miss Jenny Bramble. And she had spoke a loving word that caused his heart to flutter, for Billy had no female bird to arrange his bread and butter. But now he saddles up to Jane, although her look was snarling. Says he, quote, I am lonely in the lane, oh, will you be my darling? Said she, if you mean business and have got an extra shilling to pay my way down to the church, with all my heart, I'm willing. And as you look at the census record here, you see there's Jenny Bramble, and there's William Simmons. And they were members of his little community. And what we got in that little poem is just a snapshot of an interaction. And again, that's what I love about sources like this, ledger books and these things, is when you start cross-referencing them with these records, like census records and birth records, you start to get a picture of a community, and you start to see these folks as human beings who had similar wants, desires, and misses as we do. And the Bill Simmons poems are my favorite. There's 2 of them, because it sounds like Bill Simmons is quite a character. Some of the poems are not as fun. This is one on the death of Bessie Pinkard. And Bessie Pinkard died between census records. So we're not quite sure, where she fell into this, but these are the Pinkard families that were living in Northumberland in 1880. And so I'll read little Bessie's poem. Darling little Bessie, so long been laid away, but a place in your memory is kept for you today. We will remember, darling, that was a day of gloom, when death came uninvited from his dwelling in the tomb. But the foe had conquered, you went without a fear. But a mother wept, darling, who would have died for her. When all was done to save you, could be done by human skill, we bowed our heads in sorrow unto the Master's will. We know you're up in heaven, a little angel fair, and by the Master's blessing, we hope to meet you there. We know you will be waiting to welcome us on high, when we shall leave your sisters and join you by and by. So here you have a young lady, the Pinkards attended Rehoboth Church. They're on that slip of paper I mentioned to you earlier. Obviously, a neighbor and a neighbor child that my grandfather and his family were familiar with. So, it's again, getting to see these people and hear them come to life is what I find most enjoyable about going through these sources. This is another one, Lines to Laura Clayton. This is a Clayton family that lived in the immediate vicinity of my great-great-grandfather. They had a daughter born in 1883, but again, the records are difficult to find, and this could possibly indicate her death as an infant. So here's Laura's poem. Laura is our darling pride, Laura bright, Laura gay, laughing gaily at our side all the livelong day. There is not a bird that flies in the air or soaring in the sun, freer from grief or care than our darling one. She is full of childish prattle when climbing on my knee. Her little tongue will rattle, making music sweet to me. This little black-eyed darling, so innocent and free, although not much to others, she is all the world to me. I often watch her gambols among the grass and flowers, as over the fence she scrambles, unmindful of the showers. And now, my little sunbeam, kiss Papa sweet good night, and may the angels around you until the morning's light. So again, writing about his neighbors. There were other things. I mentioned the Rehoboth Church listing, but the other thing that was in there, in the ledger book, were lots of these little slips of paper, which had even more of his neighbors on there. And included work that he was doing for them, work that they were doing for him, members of his church, members of other churches. You'll see Baldwin Laws and Warner Ball, the Ball family and the Laws family, very prominent Northern Neck families. My great-great-grandfather, the poet, was essentially a tenant farmer in Northumberland County. So he was renting his farm and renting it from the Warner Ball family. Warner Ball was a lawyer and lived in Richmond for a while. Most of the time, he was from the Northern Neck, but he spent most of his time in Richmond. So you didn't see, he was an absentee landlord for the most part. But again, these slips of paper help flesh out his story in a way that just a census record or a birth record can't do. And it gives me an indication of how he's interacting and engaging with his local community. These are, again, census records for Mr. Ball and Mr. Laws from the 1880 census for Comico District, who all lived right in that area. Again, neighbors of my grandfather. He didn't write about his landlords, and maybe there's a good reason for that, but that's okay. And the Ball family, of course, is well known because George Washington's mother was a Ball. So, again, very prominent Northern Neck families. If you live in Virginia and I say the Ball family, everybody knows it. And of course, I mentioned that slip of paper from Rehoboth Church that has both some names and then some figures, which are tithes. I took this slip of paper and walked through the Rehoboth Church Cemetery, which is right there behind the church, just down the road, and was able to actually identify names on this slip of paper and coordinate those with headstones in Rehoboth Church Cemetery, which again, these are real people, right? They're not just names on a slip of paper or on a historical document. And this is their community that they lived in. And it's pretty telling. This is my great-great-grandfather, the poet's listing in the 1880 census for the Comico District. Gives you his whole family listing there. Jonathan G. Murphy. Caroline is his wife. She was actually born in Maryland. Thomas, Francis, Sarah, Charles, Mary, Betty, Ellen. Ellen down at the bottom here, the little 1-year-old, is my great-great-grandmother. And so I was able, just finding him and finding this one ancestor, being given this one book, allowed me to kind of start my kind of pursuit of family history and in a way that kind of was roundabout, right? I started with this weird, unlikely source for records and went into the more traditional records. This is a listing in the 1878 list of farmers in the Rehoboth Church vicinity. And if you were to read my grandfather's poetry, or even some of the ones we talked about today, you see the Pinkard family is here. You'll see my grandfather's name is in here somewhere. You'll see the Balls are in here. So it just reinforced again that the information that my grandfather was writing about in his journal and in his poetry, information I was already seeing on the census records and the other records that I was able to look at, I could confirm those with other sources outside of it, which as a historian is pretty darn important to us. And so, again, starting with this weird, unlikely source and kind of going into the more traditional sources of material to kind of find what I was looking for. What was interesting was after I had done all of this work and kind of researched my Grandpa Murphy, and I transcribed all his poetry, and had photographed all the sites in Northumberland County where he had been and lived, had kind of documented the other names that are in the poetry and written up about those. At this time, at the time I was doing this, I was working at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, but I was also working as an adjunct instructor for the College of William and Mary, and spent a lot of time at the SWEM library and the SWEM archives at the College of William and Mary. And I went to them, I took the ledger book to them, and I said, what do you think of this? Is this something that might be of interest to you? Because it was in very poor shape. I don't have a personal archive at home, probably any more than the rest of you do, where I can house it particularly in a correct archival box, or archival folders and those types of things. And I didn't want it to get ruined. And I thought it was an important piece of Virginia history and a snapshot of the Virginia community at a very specific point in time, Reconstruction period, right after the Civil War, very, very interesting period for Virginia history. And luckily, the College of William and Mary agreed. And so now, if you go to the Special Collections Research Center at the College of William and Mary, you can actually look up and pull the original ledger book of Jonathan G. Murphy papers there, so that you can actually go through them and read them yourself. They don't let you touch the actual ledger book anymore. They don't even let me touch the ledger book anymore. So you won't be able to do that, but there is a transcription of all the poems. The other thing I wanted to do, because he was, this is the gentleman, this is the man, this is the ancestor who motivated me to learn more and more and more and more about my family. And everything in my family tree started with him, really. He's my home person, and then went out from there. So what I wanted to do was make sure that, you could find him and that he wasn't forgotten. And he wasn't just a listing on a SWEM library catalog. So a few years ago, I published his poetry, his books of poetry, along with a brief history of him, that I sell just to nobody, actually. But I'm glad it's out there. So I'm happy that his history is out there, and that Jonathan G. Murphy is no longer just J.G. Murphy or Grandpa Murphy to my family. And to a kind of a bunch of people now who can actually associate it more with a human being who did some neat stuff. So that's the end of my unlikely source discussion on Jonathan G. Murphy and his ledger and his poetry. And I want to, first of all, thank you all for attending this brief first webinar. I guess about 35 minutes, not too bad. One thing I'd like to ask you, as folks who are interested in these things, if you have ideas for webinars for the Ohio Genealogical Society, if you'd be interested in presenting a webinar for the Ohio Genealogical Society, if you'd be interested in sponsoring a webinar for the Ohio Genealogical Society, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know that. We would love to partner with as many people as possible to develop a compelling webinar series that covers what is of interest to people, and what would be most useful to everybody. Of course, you can also donate. You can see the website there at the bottom, and I appreciate it. And OGS would appreciate donations as well. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Noel, who is the immigrant in the Murphy family?
The immigrant, that was his father, Thomas. And try to track down a Thomas Murphy from Ireland.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a challenge. But that he was the first Murphy to show up, and they lived in Milford, Delaware. That's where he was born and lived when he was a kid, and that's where they settled. So he came over in the 1840s, I believe it was, or 30s. No, it had to be early 1830s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Don't be shy. He's here to answer questions.
Well,
I have a question. How common was writing poetry among people in general? I mean, we might expect it from people in academia, but just to have a man who is making his living with his hands, writing these really, really lovely poems. Was that,
yeah.
I mean, before TV and radio, people entertain themselves writing poetry, or?
I don't want to speak for everybody who lived in 19th century, Virginia, about whether they wrote poetry or not, but I don't think it's common for a gentleman, for a man who made his living with his hands, laboring, to write poetry. He obviously was educated. There's no question that he was educated. So it was something that obviously spoke to him in the same way that some people play music, I suppose, or those types of things. And I'm always curious if he shared these poems with his neighbors, or if he simply wrote them for himself. Some of the poems are pretty dark, put it honestly. He does not age well. He writes about aging, and I didn't read any of those poems, but he does not age well. As he gets older, he gets darker.
Interesting. Did it take you a while to know it was poems he had written himself, other than copying poems that he saw somewhere and he really liked them?
Yes, it did. It took me a while. I wanted to search all of those things to make sure that he wasn't simply doing that. So that was a challenge. But once you got into the personal poems, particularly, once I noticed that so much of the poems were about his neighbors, I was less concerned that he wasn't writing anything, if that makes sense, because he was obviously writing about what was around him. Yeah. And so it made it a lot easier to not think that.
It's always so interesting how we don't know these things, like it didn't get passed down in family myth that, oh, grandpa wrote poetry.
Right, exactly.
It was like,
exactly. And that was so, when my mother handed me this old ledger book with the poetry in it, and it was in it's in very bad shape. And all she knew was it was Grandpa Murphy. That's all she had been told. And so I didn't know Grandpa Murphy. Whose Grandpa Murphy was it? Was it, there was no way, there was nothing. I knew nothing about this man. And so the poetry in the ledger book and the hints that were in it. And I was very blessed and very lucky to be living in Virginia at the time and having access to the libraries that I had access to in order to nail down pretty easily where he was. So that was very helpful. But it was just dumb luck. I mean, that he happened to have been there. I used to have I'll tell you a quick short story. A friend of mine used to work with at Colonial Williamsburg, is what we call a Virginia blue blood, which means his family's been in Virginia since the beginning. And his grandparents owned a farm in Gloucester County, Virginia, which is where my great-great-grandfather was stationed. And I would go to his house and we'd sit on his front porch and we'd smoke cigars and drink Maker's Mark. And we would talk about how my great-great-grandfather burned his great-great-grandfather's barn down. Which is pretty darn likely. So again, for me, as a historian first and a genealogist second, fleshing out who these names are is important to me. So I wanted to know who he was, not just where he came from and who his family was. I wanted to know something about him, and I do that with all of my family members. I just wrote something for one of OGS publications about an ancestor of mine who was a boxer in Ohio during the early 20th century. Totally, he's not even really, if you're looking at my family tree, that guy's like way on the periphery, but he had a really neat story. So I couldn't resist.
How old were you when you first learned of Grandpa Murphy, and did that contribute to you becoming a historian?
No, I was a historian already. I was already working at Colonial Williamsburg. I'd been there probably 5 or 6 years already. I was probably in the middle of getting my master's degree at the time. And that's when my mother decided she was cleaning house and found this thing and thought I might be interested in it. And that's how I ended up getting it. So no, yeah, I really, it was really after. So
I was in my mid-teens when Roots came on TV.
Okay.
And of course, everyone became interested in family history.
Sure,
And
sure.
so I asked my grandma about, where people came from. And she told me that her grandfather came from England. And that was my bug right there. England, what a great place to come from. But what's interesting is her other side of the family, the surname is Woody. And it's either Scottish or Scots-Irish. And I'm not sure. I haven't gotten them from America over to the old country. So I'm not sure exactly where, because it's actually kind of a common name in that Virginia area.
Yeah.
But one of my great grandmother's names was Ulva, U-L-V-A.
Nice.
And right off the coast of Scotland is the Isle of Ulva.
Oh, there you go. That's
so
helpful.
I did the same thing you did. I looked at the name. Yeah.
Yeah, he had a poem written. He had a poem called "Ode to Delaware," which I didn't read to you, but that's a poem he writes about. It's essentially about his service during the Civil War, just about his home state and his pride in his home state. And then he also has another poem about Ireland, which I thought was interesting, considering he never went there. So
he probably heard a lot about Ireland, though, from his father.
right, exactly, yeah. And he talks about, it's interesting, when I was there, he was he mentions a place name in Ireland. And when I went to, and it's in County Fermanagh, which is in Northern Ireland. And when I went to Northern Ireland a number of years ago, I wanted to go visit this little, it's kind of a parish. It doesn't even exist anymore because everybody left. So there's nothing there anymore other than the name. And I went to the rental car place and I said, and when you go to, at the time, this is before the troubles were completely over. When you rented a car in Ireland, they gave you they weren't happy with you when you told them you were driving in Northern Ireland. And then I told them, well, I'm going to go to County Fermanagh, into this little area in County Fermanagh. And they went, not with our rental car, you're not. So it was like, okay, well, I guess I won't be going there because, they warned me that there are roads in those parts of the counties that you don't drive down unless you live there. So, so I never got to what I believe to have been his kind of ancestral community.
Noel, I have a quick question. Now that you've made your great-grandfather's poems and stories public and preserved forever, have any other descendants of that family reached out to you and made connections?
Yes. Actually, a couple have, through both Ancestry.com, through our ancestry tree, my ancestry tree, as well as through Find a Grave, because I went into his Find a Grave and obviously blew it up. But yeah, it's been nice. What's also been interesting for me, not so much even family, but it's been interesting when someone who's a student of Virginia history or Virginia literature or something reaches out to me about it, because to me that's almost more interesting than somebody doing a family thing. They're looking at his poems in the same way that I kind of did, which is looking at it as a community and what it says about the community. So that's kind of been more fun almost than when I hear from a family member who's just interested in seeing it. When I get somebody who wants to know more about his backstory and more about his family, because even when I wrote the little booklet, I didn't have all the information I have now about it. So, which is unfortunate. At a sad tale, he dies on a park bench in Trenton, New Jersey.
Oh,
yeah. So, but that's okay. Happens to the best of us. He was old. Well, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. I really appreciate you joining us for this webinar. Please keep an eye on our Facebook page and our website as we start to schedule more webinars. We're hoping next month to have a webinar on using the online libraries resources that Linda Swanson, our OGS librarian, will hopefully be doing later this month. We're just kind of pulling that together. And again, thank you all for coming today.